The night began like any other in Charleston, with the heavy scent of salt from the harbor mixing with the lingering sweetness of magnolia blossoms in the warm September air. The Ravenel mansion stood proud against the waterfront, its windows glowing softly with lamplight, laughter echoing faintly from the drawing room where the family still gathered long after supper. Eleanor, just 10 years old, had slipped upstairs early with a book clutched tightly to her chest, her small world still innocent of betrayal. She had no way of knowing that by dawn everything she loved would be ash and memory. The first crack of smoke came through her dreams like a whisper. A faint sting in her throat, the odd taste of cinders, the faint crackle beneath her floorboards. When her eyes blinked open, the darkness of her bedroom was shifting, not with shadows but with the undulating glow of fire seeping through the wooden cracks. She stumbled to the window, hands pressed against the glass, but the night outside was blurred with smoke. Shouts rang out below. Her father's voice, deep and commanding, rose above the confusion. Then came her mother's cry, sharp and terrified. Eleanor rushed for the door, but the brass handle burned her palm. The hall was already a river of heat. She screamed, not words, just the high keening of a child who didn't understand why her world had turned to flame. Her father's footsteps pounded the staircase, but the groan of timber splitting swallowed him before he reached her. A great crash shook the floor. Eleanor stumbled backward, coughing, eyes streaming, until the floor beneath her gave way, and she fell into a sea of smoke. What she remembered afterward never left her. 2 arms lifting her, but not her father's, a cloth pressed over her mouth, a smell bitter like tar and medicine. Darkness swept in. When she awoke, the Ravenel home was gone. She was lying in a strange bed in another house, one she recognized from polite visits. The Beaufort residence. A tall man in a black coat sat beside her, hands folded, his voice soft as he explained that her parents had perished in the fire, and that she had been spared by Providence. That man was Silas Beaufort, the patriarch of the family, who declared to all Charleston that he had taken in poor Eleanor as though she were his own. The newspapers praised his generosity. Neighbors whispered of his kindness, but kindness has many shapes, and in this case it wore the face of captivity. For years, Eleanor grew beneath the Beaufort roof. She ate their food, wore their clothes, and attended their church pew. Outwardly she was a ward, an orphan rescued from misfortune, but small details gnawed at her as she grew older. Certain servants who avoided her eyes, the way Silas always silenced any mention of the fire. And most of all, the whispers she overheard through cracked doors. Fragments of sentences about deeds signed, titles transferred, debts assumed by the Beauforts in the wake of her parents' deaths. By the time she turned 16, Eleanor's childhood memories had hardened into uneasy questions. The fire had spread too quickly. The safe her father had kept in the study, she remembered it vividly, had been left untouched, yet somehow its contents were gone when officials combed the ruins. And though her parents were pronounced dead, she had never seen their remains. Only ashes in an urn presented by the Beaufort family, too finely sifted to belong to human bodies. The unease grew with every year. She became less the grateful ward and more the quiet observer, studying the family that had consumed her life. Silas remained the commanding presence, cold but controlled, his every decision cloaked in the language of duty. His son Charles, handsome and ambitious, became her constant shadow, guiding her behavior under the guise of protecting her reputation. And Margaret, Silas's wife, faded slowly into illness, her body wasting as her mind wandered into strange half-truths. It was Margaret who first broke the silence. One evening, when Eleanor brought her stepmother's medicine, the sick woman grasped her wrist with startling strength and whispered words that chilled her blood. "Your mother screamed your name in the smoke." "I heard it. I hear it still." Then her grip slackened, and her eyes glazed once more. From that night onward, Eleanor could no longer ignore the suspicions coiling in her mind. She began her own quiet investigation, walking to the courthouse under the pretense of social errands, scanning through property records that stretched back years. And there, in the dust of old ledgers, she found the pattern. Family after family, once wealthy, had met sudden ruin. By fire, by fever, by mysterious disappearance. Each time the Beauforts had stepped in, purchasing land at a fraction of its worth, assuming debts that magically translated into vast holdings. The Middleton family had gone in a riverboat accident, their rice plantations signed over days later. The Draytons, swept away by yellow fever, their Charleston mansion absorbed through tangled mortgages. The Hamptons vanished without a trace, their plantation seized under unpaid loans. And in every case, the legal documents bore the same signature. Josiah Peaton, the family's attorney, whose practice thrived on the misfortunes of others. The truth was not a single act of cruelty. It was a system, a machine fueled by tragedy, and Eleanor's parents had simply been one more cog crushed beneath it. The realization filled her with equal parts terror and fury. She knew then that she had not been saved. She had been stolen. Stolen from the ashes, shaped into a living witness kept under watchful eyes. Even her friendships had been false. At the courthouse, the kindly clerk who seemed eager to help had in fact been reporting her every move to Charles. Men followed her when she walked in the city. Letters she sent vanished before they reached their destinations. She was free in body, yet shackled in every other way, and then came the evening that changed everything. The rain was heavy, drumming on the roof of the Beaufort home as Eleanor returned from yet another furtive trip to the archives. She was soaked to the skin, her cloak dripping on the polished floorboards when she opened the parlor doors and froze. The entire family was there, Silas behind his desk, his expression a mask of iron. Charles by the fireplace, his hand resting dangerously near a pistol on the mantel. Victoria, the daughter, pale and tense, her usual sharp composure eroded by sleepless nights. And Margaret wheeled in against her will, her trembling hands gripping the chair as though trying to hold on to something real. The room smelled wrong, a mixture of medicine, lamp oil, and something sweeter, rotten beneath the surface. The curtains were drawn tight, the air heavy, suffocating. Eleanor had not yet stepped inside before Silas's voice cut through the silence. "You've been busy." It was not an accusation spoken in anger, but a statement rehearsed like a verdict. He knew everything, the courthouse visits, the documents, even her secret walk to the ruins of her family's plantation. Every movement had been shadowed, every discovery allowed, even orchestrated to bring her to this point. "You are not grateful," he told her coldly. "We gave you shelter. We gave you life, and in return you dig through ashes best left untouched." Eleanor wanted to speak, to cry out, but the weight of their gazes smothered her. She glanced at Margaret, hoping for some flicker of support, but her stepmother's lips trembled soundlessly. Charles stepped forward then, his smile small, almost gentle, but his eyes sharp. "You have no family but us, Eleanor. You will never have another. The world believes you to be a Beaufort. It is time you accept what that means." The implication hung in the air like the loaded pistol on the mantel. Daughter, ward, prisoner. And now they meant to make her wife. She felt the walls close in, every shadow of the parlor pressing closer. The rain outside pounded harder, drowning out her heartbeat. But inside the room there was only silence, and the cold certainty that her life had been decided long before she was old enough to choose it. The silence in the parlor stretched long enough that Eleanor wondered if the sound of the clock alone would drive her mad. Each tick was too loud, each passing second another link in the chain closing around her. She opened her mouth to speak, to protest, but Silas's hand cut the air in a swift gesture that silenced her. His eyes fixed on her like a hawk pinning down prey. "You have nothing outside these walls," he said evenly.
"No allies.
"No inheritance. No name that the world recognizes apart from ours. Do you understand what that means?" Eleanor's chest rose and fell rapidly. She could feel the damp weight of her cloak clinging to her shoulders, the chill of rain still soaked into her skin. She wanted to scream, to tell him she knew what he had done, but the pistol glinting in the firelight froze her tongue. Charles stepped closer. His voice was softer, coaxing, yet even more frightening. "You are our daughter in the eyes of the community, Eleanor. But in truth you are more than that. You are the key to binding this family tighter. You will not be cast aside into the world as some spinster with a tragic past. No, you will remain where you belong, and in time, you will learn to see this as mercy." Margaret gave a sudden, broken laugh, half sob, half cough, and whispered something so faint Eleanor could barely hear it. "Mercy is a word for jailers." Charles turned sharply, his jaw tight, and ordered a servant to wheel Margaret back upstairs. The bruises on her wrists caught Eleanor's eye again. The evidence of force and the truth became undeniable. No one, not even Silas's wife, was free in this house. The moment Margaret was gone, Silas leaned forward across his desk, the lamplight casting deep hollows beneath his eyes. "You will forget the archives. You will forget the fires. You will forget your parents' land, because none of it belongs to you anymore. You belong to us, and you will remain with us in the manner we decide." Eleanor forced herself to breathe. She could not collapse before them, not here, not yet. With every fiber of her being, she swallowed the cry building in her chest and gave only the smallest nod. It was enough to ease the tension in the room. Charles' hand slipped away from the pistol. Victoria exhaled shakily. Silas sat back with the grim satisfaction of a man who had issued judgment and seen it accepted. But in her heart, Eleanor vowed it was not acceptance. It was survival. That night, long after the family had retired, Eleanor lay awake in her bed, the storm outside raging as though the heavens themselves were in mourning. Every sound in the corridor, a footstep, a door creak, the faint rustle of servants moving in the dark, set her nerves on edge. She could no longer distinguish between memory and fear. Images of her parents clawed through the smoke of her dreams, calling to her, warning her. The words Margaret had whispered echoed in her skull. Mercy is a word for jailers. Days passed, and the Beaufort home became unbearable. Every glance felt like surveillance, every word exchanged with servants tinged with warning. Her letters, when she tried to write them, were returned to her desk unopened, a silent demonstration of how deep the family's control reached. She no longer dared step beyond the gates without permission. The city she had once known as her home became as distant as another country, and yet, the more the walls closed in, the sharper her mind grew. Fear hardened into resolve. If she was to be trapped in their house, then she would use the very house against them. She began to watch carefully, noting the routines of guards, the subtle exchanges between Silas and Josiah Peaton, the attorney who visited almost weekly. She listened at doorways, memorizing fragments of business discussions about new properties, debts acquired, families ruined. Slowly she began piecing together a ledger of her own. Not on paper, for paper could be found, but in her memory. Every date, every name, every suspicious transfer burned into her thoughts like scripture. Her chance came one grey afternoon, when the family gathered in the drawing room for a meeting with Peaton. Eleanor, expected to play the role of the obedient daughter, was left in the hallway, tasked with serving tea before being dismissed. But the tray was heavy, her footsteps purposeful, and as she lingered longer than propriety allowed, she caught a single phrase that sent her blood cold. The girl's claim extinguished upon marriage. It was Peyton's voice, nasal and precise. He was pointing to a document, his finger tapping the page for emphasis. Silas gave a grunt of satisfaction. Charles muttered something about timing, about how appearances must be carefully managed. Eleanor's hands trembled as she set down the tray, the clink of porcelain masking the racing of her heart. So that was the plan. Marriage would not simply bind her to them socially, it would erase her legally. Once she was Charles's wife, any lingering inheritance from her family, any claim to land or title would vanish into Beaufort control forever. She slipped away unnoticed, her mind reeling. The walls were closing faster now, the clock ticking toward a final cage. That night, she dared something she had not in years. She crept into Margaret's room, where the older woman lay propped against pillows, eyes fever-bright, her thin fingers twisting nervously in her lap. Margaret turned her head as Eleanor approached, and for once her gaze was lucid, almost clear. "You've been watching," Margaret whispered. "You see it, don't you?" Eleanor knelt beside the bed. "I know what they did. To my parents, to others. And now they mean to—" She could not bring herself to finish the sentence. Margaret reached out, her hand surprisingly warm against Eleanor's cheek. "They will devour you, child, the way they devour everything. I tried to stop it once. I thought I could reason with him, but reason is no weapon here. Only escape. Escape?" Eleanor's voice was barely a breath. "There is a ledger," Margaret said. "Silas keeps it hidden. All of it. The deeds, the loans, the fires, the deaths. Proof. If you can find it, if you can bring it to the right hands, you might yet break free." Before Eleanor could ask more, the door creaked open and a servant entered with fresh linens. Margaret fell silent instantly, her face turning slack as though the fever had stolen her words. Eleanor slipped back into the hallway, her heart hammering. The ledger. Proof. It was the first glimmer of hope she had seen in years. The next days blurred into a haze of careful observation. She studied Silas's movements, noting how he locked the study door after hours, how he lingered near the large mahogany desk where drawers were always kept shut. She watched the keys on his ring, counted them when he set them down, memorized which one he used for which lock. She knew she would have only one chance, and failure would mean not prison, but something far worse. The opportunity came late one evening when Silas was called to an urgent meeting downtown. Charles had left earlier for a hunting trip, and Victoria was entertaining guests across town. Only Margaret and the servants remained, and Margaret was too ill to stir. Eleanor slipped down the hallway, every creak of the floorboards sounding like thunder, until she stood before the study door. Her hands shook as she fitted a stolen key she had lifted from Silas's coat pocket days before. The lock clicked softly. Inside, the air was thick with cigar smoke and dust. She moved quickly to the desk, opening drawers one by one until her fingers brushed leather. A bound volume heavy, its cover cracked with use. She pulled it out and set it on the desk. By lamplight, she opened to the first page. It was worse than she had imagined. Each entry was meticulous, a list of names, properties, and dates. The Middletons, the Draytons, the Hamptons, the Ravenels, her parents' names in bold script. Beside the word extinguished. The word repeated again and again, as though human lives were nothing but debts snuffed out like candles. Fire, fever, disappearance. Each misfortune cross-referenced with deeds and transfers signed into Beaufort hands. It was all here, damning and undeniable, her breath caught in her throat. This was her parents' true gravestone, not the urn of ashes. This book was the coffin into which their lives had been sealed. And then a floorboard creaked behind her. She whirled, heart pounding. The ledger clutched to her chest. Charles stood in the doorway, rain dripping from his coat, eyes narrowing as they locked on the book in her arms. "What?" he said softly, dangerously. "Do you think you're doing?" Charles stepped into the study with the quiet assurance of a predator who already believed his prey cornered. His boots left small wet prints on the carpet, his coat dripping rain. But Eleanor noticed nothing except the way his eyes never left the ledger in her hands. The pistol holstered at his side caught the lamplight like a sliver of lightning. "Put it back," he said, his voice low, almost conversational. "Put it back where you found it, and we'll pretend this never happened." Eleanor clutched the ledger tighter. Her arms trembled with the weight of it, not the physical weight, but the crushing truth within its pages. Every name represented a life stolen, a family erased. To put it back would be to betray them all, to consign her parents once more to silence. "I know what you did," she whispered. The words came out hoarse, but they were steady. "I know everything." Charles tilted his head, almost pitying her. "You know nothing but ink on paper. Stories told by enemies. Paper can be burned. Enemies can disappear." He took a slow step forward, closing the space between them. "But you, Eleanor, you can be shaped. You can be ours. Don't throw that away." His voice softened, the coaxing tone that had once lulled her into trust when she was a child. "You were a girl when you came here, broken, alone. We gave you shelter, we gave you a name. You owe us." "I owe you nothing," she spat, her voice breaking as the years of silent suffering burst through. "You murdered them. You burned my parents alive. You stole everything, and you tried to make me forget." For the first time, his mask slipped. His jaw clenched, his eyes hardened into steel. "Then you've chosen your side," he said flatly. The pistol cleared his holster in a single smooth motion, but before he could raise it, a voice rang out from the hallway, weak, strained, but sharp enough to cut through the tension. "Don't you dare." Margaret stood in the doorway, supported by the frame, her body shaking, her face pale as parchment. In her trembling hands she held a small revolver, one Eleanor had never seen before. Perhaps it had been hidden for years, a secret Margaret had guarded even from her husband. Charles froze, surprise flickering across his face. "Mother—" "Not another word," Margaret rasped. Her eyes, once dim with fever, burned with a desperate clarity. "If you harm her, Charles, you'll have to step over my body, and perhaps that will be fitting, since I've been your prisoner long enough." For a moment silence crackled like the air before a storm. Then Charles laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You would choose her, over your own blood." Margaret's voice broke, but she did not lower the gun. "I would choose truth. I would choose freedom, something you've never understood." The standoff stretched. Eleanor could barely breathe, her knuckles white around the ledger. She felt the storm outside battering the windows, as though the night itself urged her to act. Then, with sudden clarity, she realized this was her chance. She darted past Charles, the ledger still in her arms, and ran. She heard Margaret shout, Charles curse, footsteps thundering after her. The hallways blurred, servants screaming as she flew past, skirts whipping against her legs. She burst out the front door into the storm, rain slashing across her face like needles. The city streets were unrecognizable in the downpour. Gas lamps flickered weakly. Cobblestones shone slick and black, and the familiar corners of Charleston became a maze. Behind her she heard pursuit, shouts, the pounding of boots. She ran until her lungs burned, ducking through alleys, slipping in the mud, clutching the ledger as if it were her lifeline. Everywhere she turned, shadows seemed to move, eyes watching. The Beauforts had friends in every corner of the city, policemen, lawyers, men who owed favors and debts. She could trust no one, but Margaret's words guided her. Find the right hands. By dawn, soaked and shivering, she staggered into the courthouse district. She knew only one name, Benjamin Hartwell, the clerk who had once smiled kindly at her when she was forced to accompany Silas. Margaret had whispered once that Hartwell was different, that he asked too many questions for Silas's liking. He was her only hope. When she stumbled through his office door, hair plastered to her face, clothes torn from the night's flight, Hartwell looked up in shock. "Miss Ravenel." She dropped the ledger on his desk with a thud that echoed in the small room. "Read it," she gasped. "Read it before they find me." Hartwell opened the book, his eyes widening as he skimmed the pages. His face grew pale. He shut the door quickly, bolted it, and turned back to her. "You don't know what you've just done," he whispered. "I know exactly what I've done," Eleanor said. "And now you must do your part." Hartwell hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Then God help us both." What followed was a blur of hidden meetings, coded messages, and desperate waiting. Hartwell contacted federal marshals he trusted, men who had long suspected that Charleston's glittering families hid rot beneath their polished facades. For days, Eleanor was moved from safe house to safe house, always one step ahead of the Beaufort men who scoured the city for her. She slept in attics, in back rooms of taverns, in the corners of boarding houses where no one asked questions, and all the while the storm of justice gathered strength. The ledger was copied, its details corroborated with other evidence. Names that had seemed untouchable were whispered in federal circles with growing outrage. Judges, sheriffs, politicians, all implicated. When the arrests began in early 1856, Charleston erupted. People watched in disbelief as prominent figures were marched through the streets in chains. The Beaufort name, once synonymous with power, became a byword for treachery. Silas was captured on the docks, attempting to flee to Cuba with trunks of gold and forged documents. Charles resisted in the family mansion, exchanging gunfire with marshals until he was dragged out, bleeding and half-paralyzed. Victoria, her mask of innocence shattered, confessed in exchange for leniency, revealing details only an insider could know. The trials became a national spectacle. Newspapers from New York to New Orleans carried every detail, painting the Beaufort conspiracy as a web of corruption stretching across the South. In the center of it all sat Eleanor, no longer the silenced ward, but the star witness. She spoke clearly, recounting her years of captivity, the whispered plans, the stolen documents. The defense tried to paint her as hysterical, as ungrateful, even as delusional. But the ledger, and her calm resolve, dismantled their lies piece by piece. When the verdicts were read, the courtroom erupted. Silas Beaufort, guilty of murder, arson, conspiracy. Charles, guilty of the same. His pleas of youth and loyalty dismissed by the weight of blood on his hands. Both sentenced to hang. Victoria 20 years. Dozens of associates, lawyers, bankers, officials, faced prison, ruin, or exile. Eleanor sat through it all, her face unreadable. Inside she felt both triumph and sorrow. Justice had come, but it could never return her parents, never erase the years stolen from her. When the executions drew crowds in the thousands, she did not attend. She had no wish to see them die. Their deaths would not free her. Only her choices could. With the restitution awarded her, she became one of the wealthiest women in Charleston. But she treated the fortune not as spoils, but as responsibility. Much of it she used to fund schools, orphanages, and institutions for widows and the poor. She refused the title of heiress, calling herself instead a steward of what had been lost. And yet, despite the acclaim, she never felt at home in Charleston again. Too many streets held memories of fire, too many houses whispered of betrayal. Quietly she left, settling in another state where her name carried less weight. Letters she wrote in her later years reveal a woman both scarred and strong, haunted yet determined to give others the safety she herself had been denied. The Beaufort mansion was demolished, its land turned into a public park. Today, a small plaque marks the site, bearing only a simple inscription, "To the victims of greed and silence. May their voices never be forgotten." Locals still say the place feels heavy, as though the shadows of that family linger, a reminder of what happens when power is left unchecked. And what of Eleanor? History records her as Eleanor Ravenel, survivor and philanthropist. Her testimony a turning point in federal law against interstate conspiracies. But behind the name was still the girl who once ran through rain-soaked streets with a ledger pressed to her chest, heart pounding, praying each corner would not be her last. Her story is both a warning and a beacon, a testament to how one voice, however silenced, can topple even the most entrenched corruption. She began as an orphan. She lived as a prisoner, but she died free, and perhaps that was justice enough. Pause, somber music fades in. So I ask you, was it? Did justice truly reach as far as it needed to, or did the shadow of the Beaufort stretch beyond the hangman's rope? What do you think? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more forgotten stories that blur the line between history and nightmare, subscribe, ring the bell, and join me next time as we explore another hidden chapter of America's dark past.